This is a fairly accelerated course. We are covering a lot of information. I think really the bulk of what someone needs in order to make sense of the guitar and to know what to do moving forward, at least how to approach it generally, what's going on, how to learn chords, how to learn scales, how to approach songs, how to build practice skills, and a lot of terminology. I expect that as you study this, you will have a lot more questions and you'll need to look things up as you advance. So it's the expectation for someone who goes through this course is not that they're even have mastered any of the things that we've covered in the class, but rather it's laying a foundation that a person can use so that when they go to learn a song or study a method or anything like that, they're going to know what they're doing. They're going to know how to sit with the guitar. They're going to know how to learn their chords, all of those skills that they need. And going all the way up into the main areas that most of us are looking to do with the guitar, which is basically play songs, maybe jam with our friends, maybe write our own songs. Most people's goals, if we're just talking about the average student, they're going to fall into this range somewhere. And so I'm trying to lay a foundation so that students can learn it in an effective way without a bunch of extra fluff. When I do this class again, I am going to host it one more time. I'm going to make sure that each week there's very tangible exercises to do and everything. But the point is, there's a lot of material we're going through in this, and it's fairly accelerated. So I want students to understand this. If you haven't mastered everything we've covered, that's expected, and you're not falling behind or something like this. I know that these are going to be video lessons that people are able to rewatch. You can get the terminology, you can Google search, you can find information about this stuff, or if you're working with another teacher or whatever, you know what areas you want to practice and how to communicate with them and what to look for. I may even go over a little bit of what to look for in a teacher as well. My opinions, of course. And next week is week 8. It's the last scheduled week of this class. We are going to go over some things like strumming patterns, and also we're going to talk about like next steps and like what you can do with this information and how to move forward with it. And I don't want to spend too much time on that this week, but this week is a extension of the discussion on reading tab, and as well as starting to talk about jamming with other people or jamming by yourself. And this also, jamming and improvisation ties into writing your own music and coming up with your own music as well. They're like two sides of the same coin, as it were. It's really just about when you're jamming or improvising, you're doing it in real time. You might be doing it with other musicians in the same room. And when you're writing on your own, the time constraint is different, right? You can take your time to figure stuff out and you're not worried about doing it in real time. I think of improvisation as like real-time songwriting, real-time music writing. Okay, let me share my screen. Here we go. This week, phrasing and phrase structures. We talked about this a little bit last week with Ode to Joy. Sorry, I need a little water. But we're going to formalize this a little bit in writing. And then we're going to talk about expressive techniques. So the guitar is a miraculous instrument. There are lots and lots of expressive techniques that we can do. We can do slides, bends, bend the note, vibrato, and many other things. We're going to get into that in this lesson today. We also have what we call musical dynamics. This is its own section, but it's part of an expressive technique. So dynamics is going to be how loud or how soft you're playing. We didn't talk about this exercise specifically, but we are now. It's quite a simple exercise, but one thing you can do, especially when you're practicing early on, you want to get really good at strumming quietly, so you can practice really quiet strumming. And then over time, build up to very loud strumming. And then slowly go back to quiet, very soft strumming. Loud, in music, this is what we call dynamics. And it's one of the things that separates more experienced players from newer players. I talked a little bit about a lot of beginners when they strum, it sounds like it's very, very harsh. And that's because they're hitting the strings very hard. They're gripping the pick very firmly. They're not allowing the pick to wobble. You want the pick to wobble a little bit in your fingers. And that kind of softens it. And when an experienced player's playing, they're going to play with different dynamics, and those different dynamics is going to make it so they can get it soft parts, and they can build up throughout the song. So like the verse might be really quiet and soft, something like this. The softer you play, it's a bit more intimate. And then for the chorus, you might build up. So there, the dynamics allow me to ramp and change between a more intimate part or like a more powerful sounding part. You also can mix and match between like strong and weak strums. These are called accents, which again, all of that stuff we're actually going to go over a second time this lesson. I just wanted to give a really brief overview. So let's get into this, the definitions part. By the way, this is 40 pages long now. So we're quite a lot of material to go through, and we can see. Okay, so last week we went over reading tab. It's in the video. But there's other symbols you're going to see when you read tab. And we're going to cover those other symbols today. So phrasing. These terms are thrown around. It's important that we try to understand them. What is a musical phrase? A phrase is a musical idea. It's any chunk of music that's smaller than the entire piece. A phrase can be thought of as a musical statement, idea, thought, or sentence, but it does not always have a clear boundary. Much like a sentence can be a long run-on sentence or a concise statement. Phrase is a term that's very, we'll say, human to understand. When we say a phrase, it's just a chunk of music we're talking about, right? If I say the first phrase of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, maybe it would be that. And the second phrase might be a response to it. Should be able to play the beginning of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. That's the first phrase and the second phrase of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. But someone could always argue that a phrase was half of a phrase or something like that. It's always just about the conversation you're having for the most part. Like there's not always like a very defined place where a phrase begins and ends. The same way that there's not always a clearly defined place that a thought begins and ends in a sentence. Phrases can be opened or closed. An open phrase is open-ended and unresolved, while a closed phrase ends with a sense of resolution or cadence. So this is a very important concept as you get more advanced. You want to really understand the difference between open phrases and closed phrases. For now, you can think of a closed phrase as a phrase that lands on your root note of your scale. So if we're playing a C major scale, any phrase that ends on C is going to sound closed. And a closed phrase is like a statement that doesn't require any response, right? It's like saying a sentence that's rhetorical or just any sentence that doesn't require a response. It's a nice day. It's just a statement. It doesn't require a response. And that's a closed phrase. Whereas an open phrase is like giving someone a high five and having them not respond with another high five. That's really awkward when you have that happen, to leave someone hanging. And so the open phrase has a bit of a hanging feeling. Somebody going to answer that? And then we land on the root. That creates what we call a cadence, and that closes the phrase. This idea of open and closed phrases having different amounts of tension is what moves the musical story along. And we don't have time to fully talk about songwriting today, but think about any story. We want to have some main characters, we want to have tension, we want some drama, some conflict that needs to be resolved, and then we see the resolution of that conflict and it creates a satisfying closure to the end of the story. And musical phrases are very much like this, where we want some tension and we want some closure. And so the combination of open phrases and closed phrases allows us to make a musical discussion, make a melody that's well formed and goes different places and has a satisfying conclusion. So an open phrase will be a phrase that sounds like it needs a conclusion, and a closed phrase will sound like a phrase that has been concluded. And for now, you can just think of landing on your root note of your scale as the easiest way to close the phrase. Phrasing, this is a term that's thrown around. Phrasing is the study and execution of making phrases. So it includes our note choice and our rhythmic choices and which expressive techniques we use. Phrasing can be thought of as the particular way in which you express your ideas. So the idea there is that it's not just what you say, but it's how you say it. If I say, "You're the best student ever," and I'm very enthusiastic about it, it's a compliment. But if I say, "You're the best student ever," and then it's the same words, but it's a different interaction. And I would say that it's the phrasing that's different between those things. So when we say that someone has great phrasing, that means that their choice of not just what they play, but how they play it is very nice. And that's one of the highest compliments in guitar playing. So if you ever hear a player and you want to really let them know that they're good, say, "Oh, your phrasing is just fantastic." And you'll see them light up, because when they get a compliment like that, they know, oh, this person knows. They know I've been trying hard with my phrasing, and they're appreciating something about that. Whereas if you just say, "Nice job," or whatever, they just assume, okay, that's fine. But if you say nice phrasing, they know you really were listening. Okay, now phrase structure. We talked about this last week when we went over Ode to Joy. The phrases we use letters, and in my lessons I use lowercase letters to talk about phrases. If I say a phrase is phrase A, then that means it's an idea that I could then reuse. So if I play an A phrase, can be anything you want it to be. So I could go, that's my A phrase. So if I want to do another A phrase, I play the same thing again. Now I've got an A phrase. I can do that as many times as I want. If I change it slightly, I can call it A prime. Those are similar enough that I'd say one is A and one is A prime. If I change it substantially to where it feels like a different idea, I'll call it B. So I could have an A and a B. And now I have these two characters established in the music, an A and a B, these two phrases, these two ideas, these two thoughts, and I can do something with that. I can keep repeating them, I can keep morphing them, and that's where musical composition comes out of those elements. Is you take phrases, you manipulate them, and turn it into the musical story you're trying to tell. So this is probably where we'll wrap up that phrasing discussion initially for right now. In here, I mentioned expressive techniques. Expressive techniques. This goes into reading tab as well, because when you read tab, it's not just going to be fret numbers. You'll see little symbols like this here. Okay, so we're going to go through each of these expressive techniques, and how we use those is going to really impact our phrasing, how our phrases sound, and so on. Okay, a bend. Bends involve pushing or pulling the string sideways to raise its pitch, while the vibrato is the rapid fluctuation of pitch. A bend, here I'm going to take this B on the 12th fret, and I'm just going to push it towards the ceiling. And as I do that, it adds tension to the string, and the pitch raises. So we're raising, when we bend, we always raise the note's pitch. Now this is a very expressive thing to do, because when humans sing, they don't just bounce between the notes rigidly. When they sing, they glide between the notes. So the bend allows us to do a bit of gliding between the notes. And those types of bends emulate singing, and when we emulate the human voice, it's thought of as emotional and expressive. Bends give us a way to make the guitar a little bit more human sounding and make it a little talky. And vibrato is when we bend back and up and down in time. So it creates this sort of wavering pitch. And again, that emulates a singer's voice. Gonna get copyright struck for my Phantom of the Opera melody there. Bending is semi-common on the acoustic guitar, but it is less common on the acoustic than it is on electric. So bending is often thought of as a lead playing technique. So you hear this distinction between lead and rhythm guitarist, and it's not a set in stone distinction, but when you're playing acoustic guitar, usually we tend to be playing a bit more like chords, and which you could think of as more the rhythm guitar side. But you're not going to see as many like big blues bends most of the time. There are some acoustic guitar players who will do bends, but usually they'll either be subtle, like very expressive, just kind of put onto a note real like quickly. You'll hear them. You will hear bends done on acoustic, just not as often. And this is actually true of several of the expressive techniques you'll see in tab. Some of them are more electric guitar lead oriented, but you still want to be aware of them. And again, even if you're an acoustic player, you'll find them from time to time. Now, historically, bends are not done in classical guitar, and they weren't usually done much in jazz guitar. There's still like a division between jazz players who bend and those who don't. It's a rift, okay? But that's getting into guitar like culture too much. But the reason why bends weren't as common on the acoustic initially as like classical guitar especially was because traditionally acoustic guitars were not able to be amplified. And when you bend, you can hear the string scraping along the fret and the fretboard. And if you're not amplified, that sound is going to be heard by the whole room because it's coming from the guitar, the acoustic itself. But on an electric guitar, because we can use guitar amps, we don't really hear the scraping of the frets on the fretboard much. And also, the strings on an electric are going to be a little bit thinner and easier to bend most of the time. So those two reasons why acoustic bending is not as common is because on an acoustic that's not plugged in, you can really hear the scraping of the string in the bend. That often happens. And then the other reason is the strings are a bit thicker. The third reason would probably just be sort of tradition. Acoustic players traditionally don't bend as much, so it's a little bit out of place. If you listen to Jim Croce, which I think everyone should listen to a bunch of Jim Croce, you'll hear acoustic guitar playing done in a lead style that does have lots of bends. And you'll hear there are some players who will do lots of bends on acoustic, so there's always exceptions. But yeah, most of the time, bends are thought of as more on the electric guitar side than acoustic side. Okay. Bends are broken down into kind of two common forms. We have half-step bends and we have whole-step bends. And so a whole-step bend would be from like a B note up to a C sharp, and a half-step bend would be like a B to a C. Those are a half-step apart. So 1 fret bend versus a 2 fret bend. And vibrato, you'll see indicated with narrow vibrato or wide vibrato. And that just has to do with like how over the top is it. Narrow vibrato would be something like, and wide vibrato might be something like. It's a bit different. Vibrato is considered one of the hardest techniques to master. We're not going to get into vibrato technique or bend technique today in these classes, but you can look up how to do them. And again, just when you see them, vibrato means we're putting down and up a bend in time, bending from a neutral up to a pitch and then bending back, and then doing that in even time. I'm trying to do it in a way that sounds natural. It does take a bit of practice. By a bit of practice, I mean I've practiced vibrato for years and years to get it to where I've gotten it. And I'm still not the best at it, maybe. Okay, legato. This is hammer-ons and pull-offs. You will see these on acoustic guitar quite a lot, actually. This also includes tapping. I don't think I put tapping into this document because you're not going to see it in tab. When you see tapping in tab, sometimes you'll see a T used or a plus. When you do tapping, you're using your fingers and not plucking the string, but rather just hitting the string with your finger to make a tone come out. On electric guitar, the early tapping was things like Van Halen doing things like, you see, lots of shredders doing this stuff in the 80s. These days, it's thought of as a little bit gimmicky, so if you're doing this type of thing, it's usually as like a throwback. Modern players tend to do like multi-string tapping, 8-finger tapping, and this type of stuff where they'll play more complicated and intricate patterns. If you want to look at players that tap on the acoustic, there's players like Khaki King is a really well-known player that taps on the acoustic. There's lots of people who do percussive tapping and such. Hammer-ons, pull-offs, and tapping can all be thought of as legato method. And legato is going to be notes that sound a little bit smoother, meaning we're not picking each and every note. So when we do a hammer-on or a pull-off, we're only plucking the first note, and then we're letting the second one ring out just off of maintaining the energy that we have. So when you do a hammer-on, you can pluck a note and then put the other finger down without plucking again. And you can hear that note continues to ring out. The secret with the hammer-on is to just be quick about it and to make sure that you keep even pressure on the string so it continues to ring out. For the pull-off, it's like the opposite of a hammer-on, but it's a little bit different. When we do a pull-off, we actually let the finger that's pulling off, so we put both fingers down, and we pull off from the higher note to the lower note. And when we do that, we kind of flick the string a little bit with the finger that's pulling off. So you kind of, it's almost like a string with that finger that's pulling off there. Now we have a zoomed in view we can switch to. It's going to be the next lessons that I do, the next classes that are going to be the deluxe ones. Y'all are going to feel like you got ripped off. Okay, moving on. When I'm doing this hammer-on, I'll do it in the same frets that it's on the diagram for. So I'm starting on fret 7. I just hammer on to fret 9. And then I can lift fret 7 off after that point, and 9 stays held. When I do the pull-off, I just sort of flick the string a little bit, and it's a downward motion that's happening. You just want to get a little bit of the string and sort of flick away. So there's legato techniques. You can do them back to back, hammer on and pull off, like that. And then when we do tapping, just doing hammer-ons and pull-offs with both fingers. It's a little bit more advanced to do tapping at the moment, but I wanted to show that because you will see tapping from time to time. Slides. When we slide, we pluck and we hold the fret down, and then we keep pressure down as we go between the frets. The slide is a nice expressive technique. Because again, that makes it more vocal sounding, more lyrical sounding. It's a really nice way to go between the notes is to do a slide. Palm muting. So palm muting uses the edge of the picking hand. When we talk edge, we mean this portion. You lay it on the strings, and then you lightly touch. This is going to be near the bridge of the guitar. Lightly touch the strings, and this gives it a chunky, muted tone, as opposed to with no palm muting. With palm muting. Palm muting. Palm muting. So for that, I'm just using the side of the finger. I lay it very lightly on the strings next to the bridge, and I get palm muting. Again, this is something, there's tons of tutorials on things like palm muting on YouTube. Staccato notes, these are really cool. So the staccato notes are notes that are sort of, they're held for the whole duration of time, but you shorten them so you don't actually play the note for the whole duration. So when I do non-staccato notes, a note, by the way, by definition, I mentioned this in a rhythm week, but a note is meant to last the entire duration that it's notated for. So they fill up the entire space. So if I play eighth notes, each eighth note should connect to the next eighth note. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and each of those notes lasts until the next note starts. Staccato notes are shortened. So that gives them this sort of punctuated quality. And that can be a really cool way to phrase. So you can mix and match. Let's see if... mixing and matching staccato and non-staccato notes gives you some textural variety in your playing, and you hear that jazz players and such are going to be doing a lot of staccato. You hear it in blues. You really hear it in lots and lots of melody. But staccato notes are drawn with a little dot either below or above the note head. So these are easy sometimes to confuse with dotted notes, which we talked about. But a dotted note, the dot is going to be off to the side, and on staccato notes, the dot will be directly below or above the note head. Harmonics. So there are different points on the guitar where we can find what are called natural harmonics. The easiest point to find these on is fret 12. And to play the natural harmonics, you just lightly touch the string. You don't fret the note. You just lightly touch the string, like right over the fret, like over the fret wire. And you can pluck, and it makes this sort of bell tone. These are called natural harmonics. You can find them at fret 12, fret 7, fret 5. Those are the easiest places to find them. And you'll hear those done in songs. We also have a concept of artificial harmonics, and these harmonics are not created using the open strings. They're created by manually shortening the string, and these are a little bit more advanced, but if I wanted to do a harmonic on like fret 4, I can go 12 frets above that, fret with my picking hand, and then pluck the string with the pick to create a harmonic in that spot. Those are often referred to as harp harmonics. Harp harmonics are a bit on the advanced side, but you will hear those done on acoustic guitar and electric, and you'll see them from time to time in tab. When you see them, we'll often have the fret that you're fretting and then the fret that the harmonic is found at written next to it. Those are relatively common. You're going to see them in lots and lots of pieces. And then we have this concept of ghost notes and grace notes. So a ghost note is going to be a note that is in brackets, and oftentimes a ghost note, you won't really hear it. It's like subtly implied, or it's like the guitarist in the studio hit that note really quietly, but it's almost implied. But you can think of ghost notes often as very optional. You can almost leave them out. A grace note, you see here, this little note ahead of this other note, the grace note is actually meant to be just like a quick little ornamentation that's put into the phrase. So here, if I'm really playing fret 5, but I put a grace note on fret 4. So there's just a little bit of a little pickup right before that note goes. So those are called grace notes. Dead notes are written with X's on the tab, and when you do a dead note, it doesn't really matter where you do it. It's up to you, but you can just lay your fingers on the strings and play without any note happening. Dead notes are often used for like textural or rhythm reasons. So you can put that structure in. So there I'm putting in some dead note strumming in between the chords, just to provide some textural variety there. Okay, and then the next thing is dynamic levels, which we talked about a little bit. So how loud or how softly you hit a note is considered dynamic levels. There are two accent symbols that we see. So we have a regular accent symbol, which looks like this, and then we have a heavy accent symbol, which is this sort of flipped over like this. And that just means we are going to emphasize those notes when we play them. So if I was playing, this is just the C major scale, I would emphasize the first note and I would heavily emphasize the last note. And then the notes in between that would not be emphasized. So this would be something like... very heavy accent at the end. The accent note just means to really make that note pop out and really give it some extra emphasis. So you see those accents added. And then we have dynamic levels. Now, moderately soft and moderately loud, these are like the default places of playing. But when we put a modifier of piano, this means to play it softer. Or pianissimo is even softer than piano. Or pianissimo. Pianissimo is extremely soft. So we have this extremely soft, very soft, moderately loud. These are basically like the sauce packets at Taco Bell. You have a nice range of how spicy you want it. And most of our music is going to mostly exist in this range. But this is a range. So in your music, you might see some P's written down or MP, MF. This is just saying be louder or be quieter. And so when you're practicing this on your own, you can practice going gently between pianissimo and fortissimo. So here, I would start out in pianissimo, just being really soft. And this is all relative, right? So it's just a soft for the most part. And then I'm adding over time. You know, maybe a mezzo piano right now. Now mezzo forte. Now forte. Now fortissimo. And then back down. Forte. Mezzo forte. Mezzo piano. Piano. Pianissimo. The idea is try going through those stages in your mind. And again, it's relative. So you just want to say, okay, I'm going to go a little bit louder, and I'm going to call that mezzo forte. And then I'm going to go a little bit louder, and I'm going to call that forte. And you just practice moving between those dynamic values in a way where you feel like you're developing some consistency and comfort with that. And with that as well, we also have the concept of crescendo and decrescendo. So when we in a crescendo or decrescendo, we will put this hairpin symbol that goes, so crescendo goes from quiet to loud and decrescendo goes from loud to quiet. So if I was playing this, I could do something like crescendo to decrescendo. And you just want to develop control to be able to move between loud parts or quiet parts or loud parts. And that's where the ability to really create phrases that are expressive. So we talked about phrasing, right? Bringing it back around. So someone who's creating musical ideas is going to be able to use all those different expressive techniques to create music that's very textural, or music that sounds very lyrical, very organic, very human. And as it sounds those ways, we get a whole range of emotions that come out of that, and that creates a sort of musical fingerprint in how an artist phrases. No two guitarists phrase exactly the same way. Each person's going to put their own, have slightly different ways they understand these values and slightly different ways in how they express them, and that's where a guitarist's sound can come out of that. So when it comes to improvisation and jamming, these are going to be concepts that we use for taking a phrase like, how do I want to break this down? So let's go back to some of the scales we looked at before. Open position C major scale. This is a good one. I think we went over in like our first weeks. Yes, your first scale. Okay. C major pentatonic. If we're improvising, this is going to be the most useful starting point, because the major pentatonic scale is like the musical equivalent of bowling with the bumper lanes in. You can't find a bad note in the major pentatonic scale. And when we're working with this scale, we want to think about what we call the tonic note. Remember, phrases that end on the tonic note sound resolved. They're called closed phrases. So this C note here is the tonic note. Both C3 and C4 serve as a tonic. And we can start our phrases there, and we can end our phrases there. Or we can start our phrases anywhere, and we could end them here. And any of these notes are going to sound fine for making phrases from. So if we jam with other people, we're going to be filling different roles. One of those roles is going to be a lead player, perhaps. And a lead player's job is going to be to put in some melody. And so our melody needs to come from somewhere. The place that it comes from, in this case, will be the C major pentatonic scale. So when you're jamming with someone else, you're like, okay, it needs to be in key, right? And then, so you figure out what key is it in. You can look up tracks that are in whatever key you want to play in. So the key we're working in these lessons is C major. So if I find a backing track or I jam with someone else in C major, then this C major pentatonic scale is actually going to work quite well. Let me know. Can you all hear the music that's coming through? Okay. If I take this major pentatonic scale, sound pretty good over the track. And this is how I'd like you to get started with jamming, is don't worry about structure or anything, just play some notes, play the scale. And try to play it in time. 1. So you want to count along with the track. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 3, 4. Practice playing in time. One, two, three, four. 1, 2, 3, 4. Here I'm just playing up and down the scale in time. 1, 2, 3, 4. Mixing and matching, and up and down in different ways. To get started with jamming, find a track that's in the key that you're wanting to play in. In this case, it's C major. Find the scale shape that you want to practice. In this case, it's a C major pentatonic. And then just practice going up and down the scale, trying to put notes in time. But as we do that, it's not really making discrete phrases. Notice that it's a run-on sentence, right? Because I'm just playing a scale, and it sounds like I'm playing a scale up and down. That's okay. That's the first stage of jamming. So if you start there where it just sounds like you're playing a scale up and down, that's totally fine. But as soon as you start stopping on notes and holding notes, now phrases start to emerge. And that's where the art of improvisation really comes into play. We start learning, okay, which notes do I want to stop on to sound like an open phrase, and which notes to sound like a closed phrase, and how do I make these phrases more interesting, and so I'm just going to show you creating basic phrase, but what you can do is you can just come up with a phrase and call it your A phrase, and just try that phrase over and over as many times as you want. Then once you start getting tired of the A phrase, you're like, okay, maybe I'll come up with a variation on it. So you try a variation. Or you come up with a different phrase and you call it the B phrase. And then you're like, what happens if I go between the A phrase and the B phrase? Like, you can go between them and you can practice that. So I'll emulate this right now. So level 1 is just playing the scale. So no phrases are really emerging out of this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. And that's okay. This is still jamming. It's just quite mediocre. But get comfortable doing this. Okay, if I stop on a note though, I'm going to start making a phrase. So I go, now I have a motif. 1, 2, 3, 4. A motif is a phrase that repeats, like a theme. Now a variation. So I can call that A prime. And then I can go back between A and A prime. I could have a B phrase that contrasts my A phrase. The B phrase, it just needs to be different. It could be anything you want. Something like, then we have, and then, so I can go between, back and forth, and then to the B phrase, A phrase, B phrase, and then I can come up with variations. So you can see how I went from an A phrase and then came up with some variations on that. I made a B phrase, I came up with some variations on that. I mix and match and do any variations I dream up there. And that's where the melody and the jam kind of emerges from that. But the starting place of it can be very simple. If you just start with a scale that you know is going to work well, start with a key that you know is going to work well, play that scale up and down in time, and start stopping on notes and making little phrases. And from there, you can let your intuition be your guide, or you can continue to study rhythm patterns. And the other thing is phrases are reusable, right? And this is how people get good at improvising in the first place, is like, I've done this type of phrase a million times, so I know I can start with that. I can develop it. So as you get more experience running your scales and coming up with phrases, you can develop a repertoire of starting points, which we call melodic patterns. And from those melodic patterns, you can choose the ones that you think are going to work well. And it doesn't even require a ton of imagination or anything. It's just a brute force thing where you try patterns out until you find ones that work well, and then you can get good at, over time, at coming up with variations on that. Let me summarize here. I know it's a little bit over time, but so today we looked at the main expressive techniques for phrasing. We talked about phrases and phrasing, and then the expressive elements that you're going to see in tab and how they're written out, and then quickly looking at how to apply a scale over a track that's in key and how phrases can emerge from that. So I know that's a lot that we covered right at the very end there, trying to be a good steward of the lesson time. But as we come down to only having one more week of this program, I wanted to make sure that we at least went over the basics of how phrases, improvisation, and jamming fit together, and what types of things you would need to do to develop upon that if it's something you're more interested in doing down the road. And I would say this, based on my experience, most people are absolutely terrible at improvisation when they get started with it. So if you're sitting down and you're like, oh, it always sounds like garbage when I improvise, but you haven't done hours of practice, it's expected that it probably sounds a little rough when you improvise, when you're newer at it, and it takes a long time to develop frames of reference and a good ear and understanding like what makes for a good phrase and that type of thing. So don't be discouraged if it's clunky. Just see that as a place to start. Everybody wants to be naturally very good at improvising, and few people seem to be. I've never met anyone who was great at it without a lot of practice. Just wherever you're at with it, don't see that as, a lack of talent or that you're doing something wrong. You may just well be doing it right, but you just need to practice it a lot more. And that's going to include things like playing scales a bunch as well, which we already talked about. I try to introduce that early on, because if you play your scales a lot, then improvising becomes pretty easy. But if you don't play your scales much, it's going to be really clunky. Then improvising is not going to be as satisfying, and it becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy of, I'm not good at this thing, nor do I practice it, nor do I want to practice it, but I wish I was good at the thing, but I don't want to practice it because I have some hang up around it. But in reality, if you just accept that you'll probably be really bad at improvising at first, but that's actually success, right? Success looks like being a beginner improviser, and being a beginner improviser sounds real clunky, and this is okay. The other thing is, there's a difference between practicing improvising and performing improvisation in public, right? When you're practicing improvising, it's okay for it to be clunky and for you to try the same phrase 10 times in a row and for none of them to work out. That's fine. You can try that when you're practicing improvising. When you're performing, you want to stick with the things that you know are going to work well. And that you're only going to know which things work well if you've done a lot of improvisational practice. So allow yourself to practice improvisation without any hang-ups around, does it sound any good or not? Or eventually, you're going to make it sound good. So just don't stress about it early on. And then work with your scales a lot and find tracks that are in key. I don't know if I mentioned this or not, but on YouTube, you can find tons of jam tracks in whatever key you want for free. So you can just straight up go on YouTube for easy backing track in C major. You're going to be able to find plenty of them, and all of them, that's the C major pentatonic, will work fine over any of those. So yeah, feel free to do that. Okay, we will wrap up the class there for today. Next week, strumming patterns, review of everything. Again, I am going to be running this course again in April, so if you feel like you want to come back for that. And then there's an online portion as well that I'm rushing to try to get available to help everyone out with this as well by... Hopefully I'll have that by next week, but either way, if you want to stay following along with what we're doing, I have a YouTube channel. I've been posting this stuff to YouTube, so I've only got 20 subscribers. If you haven't subscribed, I would really appreciate it. It's like very helpful. And then I'm building out for this class a totally bespoke online portal just for the students. You are able to log your practice, set goals. You'll be able to see the course, and the course material will be in here. The library of different resources that are part of the course will be in here. And yeah, it's going to be a fun little hub for students. And again, yeah, that will be freely available to y'all. Yeah, I'm also working on trying to make myself available in some capacity for lessons too, if people are wanting to do lessons. I'm in the process of restructuring things. This class is part of that.